Colleagues, I'm very pleased to be joined on the floor today by Senator Young. We are both members of the Foreign Relations Committee, both with an interest in Middle East security, and we are joined together on the floor today to give remarks and perhaps have a short colloquy about a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding before our eyes in the Middle East. Today, inside the country of Yemen, a country that, frankly, not a lot of our constituents give much thought to, every single 10 minutes, a child under the age of 5 is dying due to preventable causes. Today, 18 million Yemeni civilians, that's 2/3 of the entire population of this country, cannot survive without humanitarian or protection support. 7 million of those are on what you would call a starvation diet. That means that on a daily basis, they don't know where their next meal is coming from. They don't have enough food to eat in order to remain healthy. And 3 million have already fled their homes because of the violence that has been caused by a civil war that both Senator Young and I will talk about inside their country, and the humanitarian catastrophe that has resulted from that civil war. This is one of 4 current famines that exist in the world today. But I would argue that this particular humanitarian crisis is in some ways the most relevant to the discussions that we will have here in the United States Senate, because the United States is participating in the military campaign that is in fact causing, in part, this humanitarian crisis. The United States is an active participant with a Saudi-led military campaign seeking to regain control of Yemen from a group called the Houthis, who overran the capital and now control large portions of the country. We, of course, are allies of Saudi Arabia. The president will be visiting Saudi Arabia very soon to solidify that alliance. But it's time that we start asking some really hard questions about the conduct of the Saudi campaign inside Yemen, and whether we are, in fact, helping to create a humanitarian catastrophe on the ground, which is impossible to defend on moral grounds, but also is hard to defend based on national security grounds as well. Let's be honest about what's happening here. The Saudis are deliberately trying to create a famine inside Yemen in order to essentially starve the Yemenis to the negotiating table. Saudi Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said this. He said, "Time is on our side. Being patient is in our interest. We have the supplies and the logistics and the high morale. The enemy does not have supplies and funds and is impatient. Time is on our side, and we will exploit the time to serve our interests." Now, what are the Saudis doing to try to exploit this question of time and supplies? Well, first, they are coming directly after the main port city that brings 70% of food into Yemen and about 80% of all of the oil. That port city is called Hodeidah. And Senator Young has been very good in meetings to draw issue with what is believed to be deliberate targeting by the Saudis of the cranes in that port, the infrastructure in that port that allows for the supplies to come off of boats and move into these desperately needy areas of the country. Second, they are requiring an additional screening process for this humanitarian aid above and beyond the one that the UN has put into place. The UN is vetting supply ships coming into Hodeidah to make sure that there's really food and aid on these ships, not weapons, and it's working. But the Saudis are putting an additional process on top that is adding up to a month for the time that the aid gets off the ship and to the country, and between that and the military campaign targeting the port and its infrastructure has essentially resulted in an effective blockade being put in and around Hodeidah such that humanitarian support cannot effectively get into the country. But that's just the beginning. The Saudi bombing campaign has deliberately targeted roads and bridges throughout the country, many of them in and around North Yemen, and there are reports that the bombers have engaged in something called double tapping, which is where you hit a a civilian asset. You wait until the workers come to try to address that first strike, and then you hit it a second time to take out the civilians who have responded to the emergency. And this isn't just my opinion of the situation. This is representations been made by multiple aid organizations on the ground, and more importantly, by U.S. officials that have been embedded with the coalition. This is a quote from Daphne Rand, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. She was in charge of the Saudi coalition portfolio at State. She said, in 2015, the U.S. government offered technical training on cyber, ballistic missiles, border security, counterterrorism, and maritime security to the coalition. The precision-guided munitions that we transferred in 2015 to the coalition on the hopes that they would enable better and more precise targeting by the coalition of the targets itself. But what we have seen since is not an improvement in targeting, and the issue itself is the target selection. It is not the precision of the target itself, but it is the choice of the targets and adherence to the no-strike list. That's a really important statement, a really important sentence. Because what's happening is the U.S. is telling the coalition what are the civilian targets you should stay away from so that humanitarian aid can move into the country. And the coalition is deliberately ignoring that advice. It's not a matter of mistakes being made on the ground, though there have been mistakes. It is also a matter of a no-strike list being ignored. And I mentioned that this is not just about the millions and millions of Yemenis who are starving today because of this civil war. It's also a question of whether this is accruing to U.S. national security interests. And again, I'm speaking just for myself on this matter. We are allies of the Saudis, and there is no doubt that an Iranian proxy state inside Yemen presents a threat to the Saudi state. There is also no doubt that Houthis have been launching attacks into Saudi Arabia. That's a real security threat for our ally. But we do have to acknowledge that there are other players that exist inside Yemen today. It's not just the Houthis and those Yemeni forces supported by the Saudis. There is also al-Qaeda, a branch of al-Qaeda that we know well because it has traditionally been the piece of al-Qaeda that has the most advanced threats to the U.S. homeland, and ISIS, which is growing inside Yemen. They have taken advantage of this civil war to fill in the ungovernable spaces. Recently, with the help of the UAE, we have begun to hit back against al-Qaeda and ISIS inside Yemen. But for a portion of time, they controlled a sizable amount of territory and revenue inside that country. ISIS is growing as well. And as a group of Yemeni Americans told me in my office about a year ago, to Yemenis, the bombing campaign is not perceived as a Saudi bombing campaign. It's perceived as a U.S. bombing campaign, or at the very least as a U.S.-Saudi bombing campaign. And so when responsibility inside Yemen is attributed for this starvation campaign, it is placed upon the United States as well as on Saudi Arabia. And we have to think about what that means, given the fact that there is the potential for millions of Yemenis to be radicalized in a place with very sophisticated radical infrastructure. That's a real national security concern for the United States. And so I think it's time for us to draw a hard line with this coalition and say that we will not continue to support it if there is not real commitment made to change the way that targeting has happened and to make sure that relief supplies can flow into that country to try to address this unfolding famine and humanitarian catastrophe. We can be allies with the Saudis. We can be military allies with the Saudis. But they have to understand, and their partners need to understand, that this humanitarian nightmare inside Yemen, it's both immoral to participate in a campaign that perpetuates that kind of humanitarian crisis, but it also, in the end, doesn't benefit the long-term security of the United States or our partners in the coalition. And so we wanted to come down to the floor today to try to explain to our colleagues what is happening on the ground and see if there's a way for us in a bipartisan way to have a policy that brings significant relief to the suffering of the Yemeni people and strengthens our national security hand in the region. With that, I know Senator Young is going to say a few words, and then I think we'll engage in a colloquy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, I'm pleased to join Senator Murphy to discuss the importance of this humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And as he so cogently emphasized, this is at once a humanitarian crisis and also a security crisis in the region and beyond. I'm a new member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I have to say I've quickly come to admire Senator Murphy for his forceful advocacy of our values of universal human rights and of American international leadership. So I want to commend him for his leadership on this issue in particular. I share many of the concerns that were articulated by Senator Murphy with regard to the situation in Yemen and the Saudi-led coalition there in that country. Before getting into the specific situation in Yemen, however, I think it is important to step back and look at the big picture. The world currently confronts humanitarian crises of a magnitude we haven't seen in many, many years. Parts of Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen are all in famine or pre-famine stages. According to the United Nations, 20 million people are at risk of starvation within the next few months in these four countries. The Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross appeared before our Senate Foreign Relations Committee just weeks ago, and he called the crises one of the most critical humanitarian issues to face mankind since the end of the Second World War. And he warned us that we're at the brink of a humanitarian mega crisis that is unprecedented in recent history. Now, each of these crises are unique. They have their unique man-made causes. But in each case, the crises are preventable. They've been exacerbated by war and restrictions on humanitarian access. Now, they're complicated, and the situation in Yemen is certainly a complicated one. But the UN calls the situation in Yemen the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. According to their Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Yemen has almost 19 million people in need of humanitarian or protection assistance, including approximately 10 million who require immediate assistance to save their lives or to sustain their lives. So this is an urgent matter, which is why I'm so glad that we have the leadership of Senator Murphy on this matter and some of my other colleagues on various fronts. This is why I led a 10-member letter to Secretary Tillerson on March 23rd, calling for a diplomatic surge to address the political obstacles preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid. And I'd note that Senator Murphy joined me on that letter, which I personally hand-delivered to Secretary Tillerson. It's also why I raised the issue with Ambassador Haley in New York City. It's why I introduced a resolution on April 5 calling for the very same thing. Senators Cardin, Bozeman, Coons, Gardner, and Rubio joined that resolution. Throughout this process, rather than just studying the problem, I, working with my colleagues, have tried to focus on tangible steps that we can take to save lives and address this very troubling national security situation. And for that reason, on April 27, joined by Senator Murphy and several other colleagues, I sent a letter to the incoming Saudi ambassador, noting the important security partnership between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia's essential role as a regional leader and an ally and a partner. I asked Riyadh to consider 5 specific steps related to Yemen that would prevent thousands or even millions of additional people from starving there. Now, there's no doubt that the Houthis and the Iranians bear a very large portion of the blame for this whole situation. But I asked our ally, Saudi Arabia, to take these steps because the United States has a valuable security relationship with Saudi Arabia, and because we can oppose Iran's activities in Yemen while ending unnecessary delays in the delivery of desperately needed humanitarian assistance. These two goals are not mutually exclusive. I didn't receive a satisfactory response, and so I subsequently raised these issues with the Saudi foreign minister in a meeting here on Capitol Hill. And in that meeting, I cited the fact, confirmed again by the administration within the last week, that the Saudi-led coalition continues to impose significant delays on the delivery of humanitarian aid to the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea. Now again, this is important because the port of Hodeidah processes roughly 70 to 80% of Yemen's food and other critical imports. I mentioned to the foreign minister the U.S.-funded cranes for the port of Hodeidah that would dramatically improve the ability to offload humanitarian supplies at that port. I expressed concerns to the foreign minister about the humanitarian impact of an attack on the port of Hodeidah. Yet, as the suffering of the Yemeni people continues and even worsens, these issues regretfully remain unresolved. According to the administration, confirmed again this morning, the Saudi-led coalition continues to be responsible for an average of 16 days of additional delays to humanitarian shipments into the port of Hodeidah after vessels are cleared by the United Nations verification and inspection mechanism for Yemen. Think of it. Your children are starving to death. Perhaps your entire village is starving to death, and you have a delay of an additional 16 days in humanitarian shipments. Think of the impact that has on security in the region as desperate people are forced to take desperate measures to associate themselves with bad actors in the area. Certainly troubling to me. For that reason, I've decided to co-sponsor Senator Murphy's legislation, Senate Joint Resolution 40. Before the United States could transfer air-to-ground munitions to Saudi Arabia, the legislation would require the President of the United States to make a number of certifications. One of these includes a certification that Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners are making demonstrable efforts to facilitate the flow of critical humanitarian aid and commercial goods. I don't believe the President could credibly make that assertion until the Saudis take some of the steps I'd called for. So as President Trump prepares his visit to Saudi Arabia, I urge him to raise these critical issues with the Saudi government. I urge our President to emphasize these are humanitarian and national security issues that are priorities of the American people. And I urge the administration to ask the Saudi government to take the following concrete actions. First, renounce any intention to conduct a military operation against the port of Hodeidah. Second, redouble efforts to achieve a diplomatic solution. Third, end any delays to the delivery of humanitarian aid caused by the Saudi-led coalition. And fourth, permit the delivery of much-needed U.S.-funded cranes to the port of Hodeidah that would permit the quicker delivery of food and medicine. I've said it before, with more than 10 million Yemenis requiring immediate humanitarian assistance, there's no time to waste here. I stand ready to work with our Saudi partners to fight Iran's malign influence and take these specific steps to begin to address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Yemen. And I want to again thank Senator Murphy for his leadership and for the opportunity to join him here on the floor today. I look forward to working together more in the future.
Mr. President,
Senator from Connecticut.
I want to thank my friend from Indiana. I think he walked through his thoughtful approach to this issue, which has led him to co-sponsor this resolution, placing these very common sense conditions upon the transfer of further munitions. I might ask him a question. In his list of steps that he has asked the Saudis to take, I've joined him in that letter, as many of our colleagues have. Amongst them is a commitment to not take military action against the port of Hodeidah. We both met with the foreign minister who talked about the need to use increased military pressure inside Yemen, backed by U.S. Participation in the coalition, to try to draw the Houthis to the table. We have both expressed reservations about the effectiveness of that tactic, and we have something to say about it because none of this can occur without U.S. military support. Can you maybe talk a little bit about our joint fears or your personal fears about a major new campaign on this port that brings in so much of this aid, and how, in the end, that really doesn't further the goals of the coalition amongst the United States being amongst the partners?
So it's a critical question, and it's one I've been asking so many stakeholders involved in this issue. No one has presented to me persuasive evidence indicating that a Saudi-led attack on the port would result in defeat of the Houthi Saleh bloc. No one has presented to me evidence that I find compelling that that action would even force the Houthi bloc to the negotiating table. The onus ought to be on those who just might take a military action, which would exacerbate the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, to present that evidence. I've asked for it. I haven't received it. I think it's just as likely that an attack would push the Houthis, as I alluded to earlier, into further alignment with and dependence on the Iranians, with whom they are allied. That's the exact opposite of what we're trying to accomplish in the regions, as the Iranians continue to spread their influence and their terroristic activities across the Middle East. So this is not in the interests, as I see it, based on all the evidence available, the U.S., UAE, or Saudi Arabia, and it would result in both a humanitarian catastrophe and exacerbate the national security situation.
I thank Senator Young for, in his prepared remarks, making it clear that while we are focusing on the Saudis because we are part of this coalition, the Houthis do not have clean hands here either. Part of the reason that humanitarian supplies have a hard time getting to places that need it is because there are roadblocks put up by the Houthis as well. And there is this known connection between the Houthis and the Iranians, sometimes, in my opinion, a bit overplayed by some foreign policy thinkers, but it's real. And to your second point, in answer to my question, Senator Young, that is, to my mind, also the likely result of a deepening of the military conflict. If the Houthis had nowhere to turn, then the calculation might be different. But because the Iranians are there as a support system to lean on, a continued military campaign against Hodeidah would push them deeper into a corner and just broaden the scope of the military conflict. There ultimately has to be a political resolution here, and by simply upping the military ante and continuing the humanitarian crisis, you get further away from that political negotiating table rather than closer to it.
Indeed, yeah. The last thing we want to do is to exacerbate a situation where we already have 10 million desperate people on the cusp of starvation or passing away on account of the lack of medical supplies, and so We need assistance here, which is why it's important for the President to elevate the importance of this issue in his conversation with the Saudis during his coming visit, and I believe he'll do so. I believe he'll do so because the international community, NGOs, understand the importance of this. Many at the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development have spoken about what a serious crisis this is. And we don't want to be short-sighted with respect to what a bombing of the port could catalyze. We also need to recognize there are other players in the Saudi coalition that can be constructive here as well. And the Emiratis, I would note that they've shown a willingness to be helpful here on a couple of different fronts. And I had the opportunity to visit with the Crown Prince yesterday and received his assurance that he would seek to resolve without delay a situation related to the forward stationing of inspectors in his country so that they could pre-inspect cargo before it goes into the port of Hodeidah. That would expedite the process and help mitigate a lot of the suffering that's occurring. Also had an opportunity to discuss with the Crown Prince this issue of 4 cranes. U.S. taxpayers paid for these cranes. I mentioned them in my prepared remarks earlier, and I've heard from the Crown Prince. He made a commitment there as well, and so I am grateful for his commitment, and I look forward to following up with the UAE government on this front. They're good allies, the United States.
And it goes without saying, this is in no one's interest in the region for this civil war to continue at its current pace, and so this is an important moment at the beginning of a new administration with a pending arms sale on the table with the Saudis to use that transition moment and the leverage that exists with this new proposal for major arms sales to the Saudis to make sure that we get this right. And listen, I think there's nothing political about this. We all join together in trying to abate humanitarian crises and famines around the world, and we all want a policy that is going to bring an end to this civil war because, as I said, it is just important to remember that the most immediate enemies of the United States, those terrorist groups that do want to do harm from us, they find their most fertile ground today inside Yemen. The sooner that we can put an end to this civil war and be able to have a central governance structure that spreads across the scope of the country, the quicker we can all be focused on trying to eliminate the ISIS and Al-Qaeda presence, AQAP, as we refer to them in Yemen, from that battle space. Senator Young, I don't know if you have closing remarks, but I really appreciate your willingness to speak up, your leadership here, and I hope that we can grow others on both sides of the aisle to propose and support these common sense conditions upon this new military transfer so that we can get the situation right inside Yemen.
Well, let me just end by reiterating my gratitude to you, of course, for your exceptional leadership, for walking point on this issue, and I look forward to our continued work together. I want to thank all our colleagues who've engaged on this matter, and of course, from the floor of the United States Senate here, want to invite others to engage in this. If they have questions with respect to this matter, which is critical to our national security, I know they can reach out to you or me, and it's imperative that we send a respectful message to the administration that we think this is something that needs to be addressed in the near term. So with that, I have nothing else, Senator.